My guest today is Ken Wharfe, Princess Diana's personal protection officer. He was with her for 6 years through some of the most emotionally charged parts of her life, from the breakdown of her marriage to now King Charles, and he was her protection officer during 86 through to 94. So, Ken, welcome.
Great to be here.
I just wanna get out of here.
Hi and welcome to another episode of Suddenly Single. But before we jump into the show, please click the subscribe button if you enjoy us. Now back to our next guest. That was a pivotal time for Diana, wasn't it? You started off as the protection officer to her sons.
Yeah, that was I sort of took the job on, really following a period of disillusionment in the real world of policing in North London in the early 80s. Which was quite a troubled time, actually. You know, there was the inner city disturbances in London and Bristol, Toxteth, Liverpool. So it was a very complicated period of policing. You had Margaret Thatcher at the helm of the Conservative government, and you had this sort of the miners' dispute. So there was a great deal of political unrest, and policing was quite complicated. When I say I was disillusioned by it, I hadn't given up policing. I mean, I enjoyed it. I've already been there since 1967, but was looking for a change. It was by pure fluke, really, that an opportunity came along for me to apply for royalty protection, and I did so, and was accepted in 1986 to work at that time for the young princes William and Harry, who were then only aged 5 and 3, respectively. I mean, when I think back, there's William and Harry now well into their 40s, Harry a bit younger perhaps, but the timescale is extraordinary. But of course, I first met their mother at Sandringham, one of the Queen's residences in Norfolk. And, I suppose I, like anyone, never met any member of the British royal family before. So I was sort of rather nervous at the fact of meeting, Diana for the first time. But she made it incredibly easy for me, because I remember being ushered into this room by a very attentive butler. And there was Diana, and William was attempting to play a piano very close by. And Diana said, "I don't envy looking after my kids, Ken. They can be a bloody nuisance." And William turned around and ushered some phrase I can't remember, but to say I'm not a bloody nuisance. And Harry, who was 3, was mumbled a reply. And he, at that point, was destamenising a vase of royal lilies off this low table, which fell over. He fell off it, the glass collapsed. And Diana said, "Come here, both of you," at which point William and Harry ran for it, pursued and chased by their mother. And I'm still stood there, I haven't said a word. And I thought, well, this is amazing, because it was. Anyway, she came back and said, "Do you see what I mean, Ken?" And at that point, suddenly Diana wasn't a member of the British royal family to me. It was like somebody you meet by chance, either at a party in a pub or at a restaurant, that's suddenly apologising for something that her 2 kids have done, which encouraged a very simple return flow of a conversation that I never anticipated. And that was really the beginning. And from that moment on, I didn't see Diana, although I respected for who she was, but I saw her as somebody that I thought, I could actually get on with this woman. And from there on, it was very simple, because the conversation was certainly royal. I mean, she was certainly royal, of course, but there wasn't this barrier that people say, well, I find it very difficult to speak with her, or I found it quite difficult to speak to any member of the British royal family. But suddenly, Diana made this conversation very, very easy. And that, for me, was the beginning of an extraordinary relationship. Because soon after, once I stopped working with William and Harry, which had followed her personal bodyguard at that time being diagnosed with a terminal cancer, and she asked me if I would like to take over his role, which I did within a 6-month period of working with William and Harry. And thereafter, the remaining 6-7 years were extraordinary.
She was an extraordinarily open person, wasn't she? I mean, the charities that she took on, the way she hugged AIDS victims, etc. So it must have been, if she was actually what she probably considered you a friend, she was probably very open about everything with you as well, was she?
Yeah, you mentioned the word friend. I mean, professionally, you don't get a sort of guiding set of instructions how to sort of work with a member of the British royal family. I mean, it's really up to you and your own experience of life and your own intelligence really to work out what works. I think what sort of distanced Diana away from other members of the royal family was that she was very easy to talk to. There was no barrier, and that breaking of that barrier for me in Sandringham at that time, the first time I met her, made life very, very easy. But she was very open, and the chemistry worked. But any sort of relationship, and any professional relationship certainly, relies upon the information that you get from that person. And of course, it's a two-way thing in any relationship. And Diana would always provide me with every weekday exactly what she was going to do for the following week. So for me, it made it very easy, because most of the work that I did with her relied upon me sort of carrying out some sort of reconnaissance to guarantee her safety, but primarily to make things work efficiently. And because of that supply of information, with all the places that I went to with her, both in the United Kingdom and abroad, which ran into hundreds, if not thousands, went off without incident because of that simple supply of information. And of course, the chemistry of that relationship. If somebody trusts somebody and that's reciprocated, then it works until it breaks down. And it did break down with me in the end, because that exchange, that relationship changed. And in the end, I had to make a decision that this was time for me to leave. But perhaps we can come on to that a bit later.
Well, you were married at the time.
I was married at the time. Yes, I was.
Because that must have had an effect on your relationship, having a job that took up so much of your personal time. This is not a 9-to-5 job, is it?
No. I think
policing isn't, but
no. I mean, I'd moved from a policing career into another policing career, but of totally different circumstances. I think policing anyway is a difficult job in any relationship. But of course, the people would say, well, that's the role, and the woman that I was married to at that time understood all that. But to come on to the royalty aspect of it, it was difficult, because here was the first time that I was spending quite a remarkable amount of time away from home because of the job, not because I wanted to be away from it. The job necessitated me being away for, maybe 1-2 weeks at a time. I always found it easier for me to be resident at Kensington Palace, for example, when I was working with Diana, because, unlike colleagues of mine that were working with other members of the royal family, I can't really speak for them, but because Diana was going through a very difficult period of her life anyway, right through the mid-'80s, acknowledging the fact that, as she put it so succinctly in an interview with Martin Bashir in the 90s, that there were 3 of them in this marriage. Now, I witnessed that, and I could see that. And I think anyone in that situation was always looking for comfort and comment from friends, and indeed I became one of those friends at that point. So it was easier for me rather to be at work rather than to receive personal telephone calls from Diana at home, which she was, very capable of actually doing. So that would have been unfair on my wife at that time. But equally, professionally, it was better for me to carry on that conversation within the office and confines of Kensington Palace. So, yeah, it was difficult. My decision to divorce was not as a result of my time working with Diana. My divorce came about as a set of many circumstances that happens in any relationship. It had reached the point whereby, it was no longer right for me and no longer right for my wife at that time. So we agreed a very short period of separation until such time as we did eventually divorce, like many other people. But my role as a protection officer was not the sort of reason for my divorce and my separation and the divorce in 2004.
I believe you were with Diana at the Annabel Goldsmith's party, which is kind of quite well documented as the moment that she believed the marriage wasn't for saving. Did she say anything to you about that at the time, or?
Yeah, the Annabel Goldsmith 40th anniversary, which of course was
Yes, very well.
Camilla's sister. It was actually a bit of a fluke chance that I actually did this engagement, because this was a joint engagement with her and the Prince of Wales, as he was then. Ordinarily, his protection officer would have gone with them, but he had another issue and asked me if I'd carry that engagement, which of course I did. What struck me about that engagement was that, to me, I was just surprised that Diana would go to that engagement, knowing that the guests would be friends of Camilla. And I think the Prince of Wales himself was rather surprised that Diana agreed to accept such an engagement. But anyway, we went there, and I had this feeling that this wasn't going to go too well, because there was little or no conversation in that journey from Kensington Palace to this party near Richmond. And, when we arrived there, it was something out of... I say this because I've never forgotten it. It was like a movie that suddenly is freeze-framed, and you could see this expression on people's faces of surprise that actually Diana had arrived. And she looked amazing, as you would expect at this party.
She always looked amazing.
And, I immediately absented myself. I was not part of the party. Of course not. I was glad not to be so. And, I sort of escaped to the kitchen area or somewhere near to where the party was. And I'd been there for about, 30, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, maybe. I can't remember exactly. But I then remember Diana's voice calling for me. And I went outside and I said, what's up? What's the matter? And she said, I can't find my husband, Ken. I said, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? And she said, I want to go and find him. And I said, are you sure about this? I said, look, whatever. She said, no, I want you to be there. I want you to witness something. And I said, well, witness what? And we had this sort of conversation in this corridor. And we eventually went to this basement area, and there was Charles and Camilla sat on this sofa talking. And of course, when Diana entered the room, there was a shock of surprise beamed across their faces. And Diana, with a great deal of confidence, I remember, walked across to Camilla as if she was about to say something that she'd already rehearsed. And she said, look, please don't treat me like an idiot. I know what's going on. I know that. And there was a sort of pause, and then Camilla said something like, well, it's okay, Diana. You have two wonderful children. I don't think Diana understood what was meant by that. I certainly was confused by it. But I was confused anyway and embarrassed that I should be in the middle of this discussion that clearly had nothing to do with me, and there was no reason for me to be there. And at that point, I tried to exit myself, and Diana told me, said, no, Ken, I want you to stay. I want you to stay. I want you to listen. And then, of course, I just wondered how much longer this discussion was to continue. It ended very quickly, but I conveniently sort of blanked myself out of actually hearing it. I didn't want to hear anymore. It was painful enough for Diana, for sure, but it's pretty painful for me as well, being part of what was an incredibly personal conversation between three people. The one woman that had changed Diana's life for certain. In other words, the prince's mistress. And suddenly, her protection officer is suddenly on the outskirts of this room, listening to this discussion. And it ended. And soon thereafter, we left to return back to Kensington Palace. Again, the return journey was almost a repeat performance of the first, in that nothing was discussed, both looking out of each of their respective windows. And the following morning, we carried on whatever the next duty was. I can't remember what it was. But Diana was, in a way, as good as she always has been. I mean, how she dealt with these problems is something that I always never really understood, because they were quite dramatic moments in her life. And yet she had this ability to perform for her public, which she always did, despite this unhappiness that had existed through most of her married life. And she was actually a consummate performer, but believed that this, and I believe this was really the beginning of the end. But Diana, like most of them, but I've always thought that the royal family is a bit like the theatre. The minute you sort of step out of that gate and you walk across the bridge to your public, you're on stage, and really your success depends upon how good a performance you give. And I think part of Diana's popularity, or the reason for her popularity, was that she was, your consummate performer. She was an actor in every sense, because she performed, but performed because she wanted to perform. She was there, and her reason for performing was that her loyalty to Her Majesty the Queen was such that she was out there representing Her Majesty the Queen, and for that reason never wanted to fail. And in all the engagements that she did, many with me, of course, but there was never a failure. She represented always the very best of Her Majesty the Queen at that time.
Do you think she got the love that she didn't get from King Charles now, from the public, really? Do you think she got her valification of...
I don't know whether there was... I think... I wouldn't say there was a... I think there was a love of interest. There's no doubt about that. I mean, she had an extraordinary following. And I think that was all due to the fact that unlike most members of the royal family, who likewise, I'm sure, do represent the best interests of royalty, and they're representing the monarch at that time. What I admired about Diana was her genuine engagement with the people that she spoke to, people from a cross spectrum of life, really, and class, if that's a word you can use these days. But that never mattered to her, and there were so many incidents that I could tell you about her engagement with people, and they were genuine. I mean, if she saw somebody that was, sort of tiring, or somebody that was aged, or somebody that had a disability in the crowd, that she would sort of focus on that, because she wanted to know why they were there. Why have you come to see me? And she would engage them in a conversation that was simple. There was nothing complex about it. She would always able to home in on what that person would want to say. So that person would have the conversation. It wouldn't be about Diana talking and telling her about life. She wanted to hear about what... She was quite a good interviewer in that sense.
Well, she could have had my job.
She'd be very good at it.
Yes, she would have been. I mean, she was 19 when she got married. I mean, that's young for anybody. She had her boys in her early 20s, and you're married to a man who, yes, you are now, the Princess of Wales, but there wasn't really ever any personal... Well, it's easy for me to say maybe there was personal love from Prince Charles in the beginning, but she was never lucky in love, even when they split. For someone who was so beautiful, she did seem to be quite a bad picker of men. Would you agree with that, or not really?
Well, I think the marriage in 1981, to Diana genuinely, I believe that she did love the Prince of Wales.
Entirely.
I mean, she said that to me on many occasions, and on many occasions in the presence of her late mother, Frances Shang Kidd, who incidentally was in the latter part of Diana's life, her best friend. There's no doubt, and I was very fortunate enough to witness that. And I think then in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, I think the daughter needed that help and support from her mother, which she did from Frances, who herself had had a pretty checkered background in relationships. But that, in a way, doesn't need to be seen as a negative. I think the experiences that Frances had had, certainly in losing her children to then Lord Spencer at that time, which was quite unusual in any court settlement to lose custody of her children. But she disappeared and legged it to Australia for a bit, but came back, I think, for a very much a wiser woman for that. And the conversations that I was able to listen to between Diana and Frances were such that I always thought, well, look, here's a woman that's really giving you the very best advice. They sadly fell out after I'd left for a very short period of time, which I always thought was a very sad thing to have happened, because even at that time, Diana needed that support from, a good friend, of which Frances was, as well as being, a very good mother. Camilla had never disappeared in this relationship. This was the problem. I think even Diana accepted at the very beginning that members of the royal family, Prince of Wales, historically have had their relationships, and assumed somewhat naively that this would just die away and we'll carry on, we'll get back to normal. But it didn't. And despite what he has said, and despite what others have said, Camilla was always a presence within that relationship. And so you have to give, in my view, exceptional credit to Diana for working through that, so publicly, knowing full well that there was very little chance of this relationship, this marriage, ever succeeding, which of course it didn't, because it would never. It was almost impossible for that to continue in the way that it did.
I think we were talking earlier about you working in Soho and talking about the 60s, and it feels to me like the royal family are over here in this almost Victoriana state of affairs, while the rest of the world is doing something completely different, particularly Britain, the swinging 60s and, openness and all the rest of it. And they are still looking for a virginal princess to marry the prince, and everything continues as it was. And yet there was something in Diana's personality that was very much modern. Do you think it was ever going to work out? Because, like you said, you could have met her. She could be a mum in Hampstead or Highgate and just telling you that her kids were... She seemed to be not very royal in that respect, even though she was blue-blooded. She seemed to have a warmth about her that, I won't name any of them, but I have met several members of the royal family, and you still want to bob and curtsy, and they don't really talk to you.
Well, I mentioned earlier the late 70s and the early 80s, certainly in 81 when Diana was married, you had the sort of Queen Mother that was, in a way, more important than her daughter, the Queen. I mean, there was the power. Yeah. And, with some old traditional values of this marrying into royalty. We know that, you come on a decade and you look at the marriages now, the marriage of even her son, William, to Catherine, a commoner, whatever that phrase means. Princess Anne marrying her equerry. Dare I mention it?
Harry.
Mountbatten-Windsor and Fergie. So things changed dramatically in this period. But, Diana, part of the problem was Diana was incredibly popular. And from my observation, and I don't think it's true, and I think others will endorse it, that part of the problem for the royal family at this particular time was how do we deal with Diana's popularity? For me and for Diana, it was a way of making good what the royal family was. And for me, I think the royal family, the Queen and her husband for certain, missed a trick here. Because actually what Diana was doing was actually promoting the very worth of the royal family by being who she was, by being popular. And instead of enhancing that and bringing that popularity on the side, they pushed it away. They didn't like it. It was a form of jealousy, and they couldn't cope with it. And I witnessed this so many times. And you mentioned earlier about her championing for good causes. I remember Diana saying to me, after she sort of ticked all the boxes of what it's like to be royal, and nobody had given her one single piece of advice how to be a princess or how to be part of this family. Once that wedding had happened and the booze-ups had finished, she was there to do her own thing and did it her way. It just so happened that it was the best way, as it so turned out. But she had ideas. She wanted to break away from launching street fairs and, opening that shop and opening that shopping centre or visiting that dance factor, which were all part of being royal and had for good reason. But she wanted to do something that was worth more than that. And she'd met Elton John at this time in the mid-80s and had witnessed the sort of struggle and the sickness from people dying from AIDS. And it was a subject that was almost taboo at that time in the 80s. People, it was referred to as the gay plague, and and so forth. It had terrible connotations, and Diana wanted to break through this because realised, look, we have to deal with it. This is a huge problem. And Diana was of the belief that, look, okay, how can I help in this? Well, as a member of the royal family, she could help in the way of raising funds and money. This is what this tragic disease needed. It needed money for research to solve it. And I remember her going to see the Queen one day. And I didn't know at the time that she was going to mention this, but she came out from this discussions that she had on a fairly regular basis with Her Majesty. And she came out, I was waiting in the garden at Buckingham Palace. And I remember her coming out very tearful. And I said, what's up with you? She said, oh, you wouldn't believe what the Queen has just said to me. I said, well, go on, tell me, what was it? She said, well, I mentioned, she asked me what I was doing, and I said that I very much involved in my charities. And I'd very much like to get involved in finding ways through a patronage to raise money for research in the AIDS issue. And she said, the Queen looked at me and sort of turned away. She said, well, why do you want to do that? Why don't you do something nice? And she said, I was actually speechless after that. I couldn't really make a comment. Well, thankfully, Diana did get involved with that. As we know, in such a way that, and there's no doubt in my mind that her contribution was a huge success in ultimately bringing about, success in research because of her patronage and because of her way of actually making money. And this is what these charities want from their patrons. So, there was one example of Diana working in a very positive sense, but there was a great deal of negativity came out of that. But she was able to ride that. But again, her popularity and her publicity that came out as a result of working with the AIDS Foundation was a problem that the royal family had. They just couldn't accept that just how popular this woman was. And it's her popularity, Siobhan, that we talk about now is why that she was so popular and why now, even 30 years after her death, I'm actually talking to you about it because people still talk about the magic. And I use that word because she was able to give magic to things and make things work. And okay, she'd be the first to admit that, she didn't leave her school with any great qualifications. But Diana, I think, unlike a lot of royals, had a sort of street sense. She was streetwise and was intelligent enough to realise actually what she was good at.
Emotional empathy is what she had. I mean, I remember finding a couple of things extraordinary. One, her, the touching of the hands of the AIDS victims. I remember watching it thinking, wow. And then also the way she took the boys to the shelters, the passage. Do you think she still has any sort of influence on how they've turned out, particularly William? Because he seems like a really good guy.
That's a good question. Talking about her two sons, I remember in my first engagement working with them. I mean, Harry was 3. He barely put a sentence together. And William was 5. William was quite a serious character. And I think people now see that in his role now as the Prince of Wales. And as children, Harry was the sort of the entertainer, the fun guy. And I think we saw that through his life. And certainly, just prior to his marriage, he was incredibly popular. And some have said, look, even more so than the Queen. And you could see his mother in Harry because he was a bit of an entertainer, really. He actually moved the other side of the Atlantic, so we see or hear very little of him now, apart from his legal actions and so forth. But we could talk about that later, maybe. But to answer your question, William, in his life, a lot of what he's done with his own children has been a complete sort of copy of what his education was. And Diana certainly didn't want an education for her children in a way that her husband was educated. It had to be open. Okay, yes, they got a fee-paying schools. I mean, I couldn't really see, although it would have been great if they did, I couldn't see Harry or William going to a state school in North London. I think they'd be much the wiser for it, if I'm honest. But they did. They went to schools that Charles didn't go to, and they were encouraged to bring kids back to the palace to play with, to give them this normality that Diana craved for. I mean, it's something she always said to me. She said, "I just wish I was normal." Well, I think I knew what she meant, but it's almost difficult to be normal within the structures of the royal family. One could say that their lifestyle is actually almost informal or abnormal, rather. But I think that William, I think they lead an almost identical lifestyle. I think things are difficult now with social media. They don't have the sort of pursuing paparazzi in the way that their mother did. And she dealt with that, I think, incredibly well. And I disagree with a lot that's been said about the media. It's not that I have a particular direction in how the media operated, but, you know, they were there for a reason. And Diana dealt with that. I think she found it annoying at times and invasive. There's no doubt. But that was the 80s and 90s. Things have moved on since then. But both William and Harry had what I saw as a very normal, within the confines of royalty, childhood, thanks almost entirely to Diana. And to be fair to the prince and the king that he now is, I think he acknowledged that Diana gave the two boys a better lifestyle, a better upbringing than he could do. I mean, he knew about the hunting, he knew about his friends, which, you know, were great for him. But what William and Harry wanted, they wanted a style of living as two children that was fun, that was exciting. And they wanted to go out to burger bars. They wanted to go to theme parks.
Towers.
They wanted to go to, exactly. And this is something that the prince, it was a bit of an anathema to him. I mean, the idea of going to Bill Wyman's Sticky Fingers in Kent High Street, to William and Harry, that was the best thing ever, to go there with his mates, knock into some burgers, have some chips, and have a laugh, run around the restaurant like kids do. And I witnessed those on many occasions. They were wild times, but it was fun for them, and it was all part of the education that Diana wanted them to have. And I remember going back to Kensington Palace, and the prince was there, and he said, "Where have you been?" And William said, we just been to a really good restaurant, Papa, and we've had burgers and chips and that." And he looked at Diana and he said, "Why do you take them to these places? You know, we've got a perfectly good chef." And, you know, you have to laugh at it. But again, it was all part of Diana's upbringing. It's like taking the kids to Marks and Spencer's in Ken High Street. And I remember going there, and what do kids do there? They pick up a basket and they go and pick up stuff that they don't really want. It's what children do. Anyway, most of the stuff we had to give back to the cashier on the way out. And again, we went back to Kensington Palace, and the prince was completely... He couldn't work out why he would take his children to a supermarket. And part of it I see, because his argument is, well, wait, we've got people that go to supermarkets for us. We have people that cook our meals for us. You don't need to go down with your wine basket to go and get the weekly shop. But this was all part of Diana's education. This was her style. This was what she wanted. And I'm glad, actually, in a way, not that I don't know, William may go shopping at supermarkets. I doubt it somehow. But it was part of an education that Diana sort of managed, and I think worked. And what we see in William, particularly, because we see more of him now, very much in a royal role than we do with Harry, that I think is all part of his upbringing and part of his mother's relationship, that I think sort of gave him a direction as to where perhaps he, as a future king, you know, might take. And I think Diana was very influential in that.
I think you can see that. I mean, even in the weekend papers, he spoke about his devastation quite openly about Kate's cancer diagnosis, etc., which I think is probably that kind of empathetic thing that he gets from his mother when he does open up, which is not as much as Harry, as we've discussed. But I think you parent as you were parented. You might disagree. So Diana was quite used to trying to make a divorce situation work, whereas the king wasn't really. And I wonder how much more of an influence. I think she would have had a very pivotal role where she's still with us. And we can't really dispute the fact that she would be alive if they hadn't divorced.
I think that's highly possible. It was just rather tragic, the circumstances of that relationship, which ultimately led to a separation and then, of course, the divorce. The tragic circumstances of her death, I don't think anybody would ever imagine something like that would have happened. But maybe you're right. There again, I've had the divorce happen and Diana was alive today, a woman now in her 60s. Often I'm asked, what role do you think Diana would have taken? There's no doubt that had she been alive, she'd have been involved in some major charitable cause globally, I guess, because she was good at it. Whether Charles would have married Camilla, that's another interesting subject. Personally, I don't think that, had Diana lived, I don't think that relationship would have actually turned into a marriage and Camilla becoming queen. Interesting enough that I don't think even Diana imagined that Camilla would become queen one day. So it's interesting to say, or it's interesting to understand that had she not, died in that tragic accident in Paris, who knows where, Charles Camilla would have been. I don't know.
Do you think there was a naivety about Diana right to the end? Do you think she trusted too easily?
I don't think so. You mentioned earlier about relationships. I mean, I was very much involved. I say involved with it by virtue of my role as her protection officer. Her relationship with James Hewitt.
Yes.
Well, a lot of negativity was about at the time, against Hewitt. And again, I'm not here, and I've never passed any moral judgment about other people's relationships. And what I would say, I met Hewitt on many, many occasions, and I found him actually to be, actually quite a nice guy in the sense that he was aware of the complications of having a relationship such as this with, a married woman that just so happened to be the wife of the Prince of Wales, the future King of England. And that was a very dangerous course for him to take. Dangerous in the sense that it must have been quite difficult for him to come to terms with it mentally, and also actually not knowing where it was going to end. I knew that it was going to be very short-lived, and if Diana was honest, I think she knew it was going to be short-lived as well. But you have to look at why this relationship began in the first place. Well, it's pretty simple to me that she was aware that, her husband was in a relationship, and she, as a young woman, thought, well, why shouldn't I be in a relationship? For all the reasons and what relationships bring. It brings a harmony, it brings a sexual relationship as well, which clearly happened with Hewitt. We know that. And so I think, at that time, I think the relationship with Hewitt did bring her some happiness. Of that, there's no doubt. But she herself had to consider, where does this go? How do I deal with this? I'm not absolutely certain as to why that ended. I'm pretty certain that in her mind that it was going to be short-lived. It was a question really of how to end it. And I think relationships, for all of us, that's the difficult part. Finding the relationship tends to be the easier bit. Ending it is somewhat more complicated. But I think in that particular relationship, I think Diana did grow up considerably from that. Were there other relationships? I'm not certain. People talk.
You don't think that?
Well, people talk about.
Khan?
Well, Hasnat Khan was a relationship that came out of the end of a marriage, effectively.
Oh, you mean during the marriage?
Yes, yeah. I think during the marriage, I think relationship with others, I have no evidence to suggest that they were anything other than friendships.
Do you think it cost you personally working for her for 6 years?
No, I don't think it cost me. I mean, I found part of the job stressful, but I think for obvious reasons. But I mean, there are ways of managing stress. I mean, I like to think that I dealt with that pretty well. No, I don't think so at all. I considered it to be a privilege.
Oh, you touched on him briefly earlier, Mr. Mountbatten-Windsor, as he is now known. Did you have much to do with him when you were protecting Diana? Did you see anything of him? Was he ever a strange character?
Ever since the Epstein crisis that hit the royal family, I've taken a personal stand on this. The whole issue of the Duke of York as he was, and now Mountbatten-Windsor, is excruciatingly toxic, and continues so to do. I mean, there isn't a day now in the last 6 months where there hasn't been a story surrounding the Duke of York, Windsor's association with Epstein, which is now brought into contact his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson. It's a subject that as yet is not finished. It's only just begun, and who knows where this might end up. So I've chosen personally not to get involved with it. To answer your question, I'll be as brief and as simple as this. I did on a few occasions had dealings with him in a professional capacity, and I found him to be, and I'll end it after this sentence, to be one of the most arrogant individuals I've ever had the misfortune of meeting. I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Moving on to another controversial figure, but in a much nicer way, Prince Harry, that I think we're all quite fond of. You did say that he reminded you in some ways most of his mother, and I would agree with you, even to the respect where I think Diana always wanted to run away from here when it got really tough. I think she looked that there was rumours that she wanted to live in America. There were certainly rumours that she would have gone to Pakistan had it lasted with Hasnat Khan. I think that's I see that in Harry, that need to just go away from it. Would you agree, or?
I do see likenesses there with Harry and his mother. I mean, just to sort of clarify 2 points there. I think Diana, sort of post her divorce, I think had the Hasnat Khan relationship worked, I think an exit to Pakistan would have probably worked. I think as best it could have done. Mm-hmm. And I think there were suggestions that she would have lived in America. Who with or what for, I mean, nobody knows. But I think there was a sort of an exit strategy, certainly on her part, once she felt that she could no longer be of any value to the royal family. Up until that point, no, I don't think there was any chance of her moving on. Now, if you come on to Harry, for example, he had there was a deal done here. He married Meghan Markle, and everybody at that time thought this was the greatest thing that ever happened to the monarchy, this monarchy, and, well, in the history of the monarchy. Here was a prince of the realm marrying a woman of mixed race, mixed heritage, an American, a divorcee. I mean, it had all the qualities that, had you given that 10, 15 years ago, there would be no chance of that ever happening. Would never have survived the critics within the royal family at that time. But here we had something that could have really moved and changed the royal family, forever. Mm-hmm. But it never worked. Because I think Meghan never really understood it. And I don't think Harry really anticipated at that time that in some months later he'd be disappearing to America to live a life of exile almost. Mm-hmm. Looks as though he may well have won a case to restore his security when he comes to the United Kingdom. And in a way, although I was against that initially, I do think that the climate has changed globally, that maybe the government and the Metropolitan Police will actually agree to provide him with some proper security, which he's always wanted. And where does that lead him? His father, the king, himself now going through a very difficult period of life, trying to sort out, his younger brother's problems, which we've touched upon, which don't need any further discussion. But William and Harry particularly were to be part of the king's future design of the monarchy. But unfortunately, he's lost that third, that Harry third that I refer to, who I think was an important part of restructuring the monarchy for the future. Because, like it or not, Harry at his time of his marriage and just before that was an incredibly popular member of the royal family because of his style. You know, he doesn't speak like any other member of the royal family, and he had that sort of that passion, that desire, that normality, that wish to become part of society, and he believed in that. And I think to this day, I think he still believes that he has a role to play. Maybe his father, the king, thinks that as well. But if that is to be the case, he has to sort out his relationship. Now, again, I don't quite know where that is. There's every reason to believe that his marriage is sound and he's happy with it in his marriage. He's clearly not happy, in my view, with living in America. I think, you know, the fun of those days in Montecito and the celebrity world that he moved in, I think that's faded and left him somewhat isolated. Does he have a role to play back in the future of the monarchy? I think he does. Quite how he does that, of course, I don't think anybody knows yet. This is where the royal family can be quite powerful. You know, I saw it so often in Diana, where her mere presence could generate thousands for that charity. And she knew that. Did she like that? I think she enjoyed being part of it. It was part of her job to do that. And for that reason is why she continued right through her marriage until such a point in 1993, exactly following the announcement by John Major in the House of Parliament in 1992, where he announced that the Prince and the Princess were to separate. That really was the beginning of the end. And try and put yourself in that situation when you know that your job is over. How do you sustain, how do you work with any real sense of purpose in a job where you know that it's going to end? That was a difficult year for Diana. It was a difficult year for me too, because I knew that my time was up. People ask me, you know, what would be your abiding memory of Diana? Yeah. I would say for me it was fun. She was fun to be with, and was caring, and would always ask, "How are you?" I mean, whenever I turn up, what sort of weekend have you had? What have you done this weekend? And I remember coming back once from my aunt's place in Dorset, and she said, "Oh, you had a good weekend, Ken?" I said, "Yeah, I went to." I said, "I had a great walk on the beach this morning," which was Monday morning. I said, "It was late Monday afternoon." She said, "Oh, you're so lucky." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, I can never do things like that." I said, "Well, you could. You never. No, I can't." You would insist on having your colleague there, that colleague there, and then we have to do a security check and all that. I said, "Well, no, you've never asked." She said, "What do you mean you'd let me do it?" I said, "Well, if you ask me, we could have a look at it." And then the following Thursday, she said, "Well, why don't we go down to this beach that you've been onto on a Thursday?" I said, "Okay, look, on the proviso that you don't say anything to anybody." I said, "If you do, then the world and his dog does know. If you promise not to say anything, we'll do it," which she didn't. And we drove down, and I always remember it as a Ford Mondeo. It had it was red and black, two-tone Ford Mondeo. Can you imagine Diana driving in a Ford Mondeo? And we drove down to Poole Harbour. I remember getting on the chain ferry that crosses over from Poole to Studland. And there was all these white van workers going across to Studland. And I remember this one guy looked into the car, and he said, "God," he said, "there's bloody Diana in there." And of course, nobody believed it, because I don't think he believed it. And of course, the thing drops down the other edge, and we drove off. And she said, "Oh God," she said, he recognized me. I said, "Yeah, but I don't think he believed it was you." Anyway, don't worry about it. It was not a problem. And I gave her this radio, and she had this leather jacket on and a pair of jeans, and it was the jacket that Michael Jackson had given her.
Oh, yes.
And we landed on the other side, and there was this shoreline beach at Studland Bay. And I said, look, if you travel around there, I said, you won't see anybody. Now it was about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. I said, if you see anything, just press that button and I'll come and find you. Now, there's a risk element from me. I accept that. But, life is full of risks and there's nothing 100% secure in protection, which I found out on more than one occasion. But anyway, I was very much prepared to do this for her, to give her this privacy, to give her this normality that she strived for, to give her the fun, to be alone without me in the middle of nowhere on a beach in Dorset.
Now, Ken.
No, but hang on a minute. There's a good story at the end of this.
Okay.
The radio crackled into life about after 35, 40 minutes. And I said, what's up? And I could hear this laughter of hers. So I thought, well, isn't that too serious? So I said, what's the problem? And you said, you never told me about the nudist beach. And she'd struggled across 12 of these septuagenarian males having a sort of a late spring dip in this beach.
Oh, how grim.
And,
poor girl.
But she found it entertaining.
I'm sure she did. Where is this beach? Is it still going?
Studland Beach. I think they're still doing it.
Okay, Studland, be on your guard. Now, you said life is full of risks. Yeah?
Yeah.
So I'm going to risk it with you now. We're going to play this game of mine called the Honesty Box, the Suddenly Single Honesty Box.
What is your idea of a perfect evening with your partner?
Yes.
My partner I've been with for 25 years was actually the best thing that ever happened to me in my life.
Oh, that's wonderful.
No, I say that. And I inherited 5 children. And the youngest of which was 10 at the time. They've all successfully grown up, and we now have nearly 15 grandchildren.
Wow.
So my idea of a perfect evening is, given the sheer numbers and size of this family, and interesting enough, the family has grown in a direction that I'm still, friendly with my partner's ex-husband. So it's quite unusual in that sense. But my perfect evening is for me to be involved with all the sort of the family antics of the children and the grandchildren, who are obviously not my children because, I'm not their father. But what I have actually collected there was 5 amazing adult friends, and now nearly 15 incredible grandchildren.
What do they call you?
Well, my name, actually, my nickname, they call me Bates.
Bates.
Yeah, I tell you why. When I first met my partner, one of her sons, I was quite keen on gardening. So I used to do quite a bit of gardening at that time. And although they knew me as Ken, I got nicknamed as Bates the Gardener. And so I was known as Bates. And I had an opportunity in 2006. We purchased a chocolate Labrador.
Oh.
And I decided to call, in fact, the kids bought the dog for me, actually. So I decided to call the dog Bates in the hope that title would transfer from me to the dog. But unfortunately, it didn't. And I'm still to this day known as Bates.
Final question. You may have just answered it. Pub or hotel bar?
It depends who I was with. I'm not normally somebody that would drink on my own, unless I had to. So, yeah, I always like to drink with somebody. It really doesn't matter to me. If the friendship's good, if the relationship is good with whom I'm with, it could be a bar or a pub. But, yeah, I enjoy pub atmospheres. When I was in the West End, I had a few favourite pubs that we'd go to. So if I had to make an absolute decision, Simon, I'll say I'll take the pub.
Okay, well, I'll take the hotel bar then. And on that note, Ken Wharfe, thank you so much for joining us on Suddenly Single. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed it.
Well, I've enjoyed it too.